Now that we've discussed the VPN types, let's see if we can layer the AWS specific components on top of this diagram here to illustrate what the capabilities are from an AWS VPC perspective. Now, from a remote access perspective, this will all have to be manually configured. You will have to deploy an instance, and this instance will have to be configured to be a VPC, whether you're deploying a Linux instance, a Windows instance, maybe put remote routing and remote access on it. That's all a manual configuration that you can absolutely deploy on the AWS side and configure it for remote access, and bada bing, bada boom, you're up and running. That is not anything where AWS will be able to help or automate or offer any kind of automation around it. But it is definitely doable by virtue of just deploying an instance. Now, the things that AWS can do is the hardware VPN. Now, what you have here is you'll find that I changed the drawing there to the AWS cloud, and it's hardware-based VPN. Now, the thing to note about a hardware-based VPN is by default, when you configure it, AWS, the AWS side, will be configured for port redundancy or dual port. So you'll have dual routes to the AWS cloud. Now, you still have to have those dual routes on the customer side. So you still have to have, like, for example, 2 routers, maybe 2 internet connections that are going there to take advantage of it. But at least the AWS side has multiple connections, multiple routes, port redundancy. So you know that that's available there. Now, I mention this because when we start talking about Direct Connect, you're going to find that Direct Connect by default doesn't have port redundancy. So I just wanted to keep some of those in mind. Maybe they come up on the exam, maybe they don't. But this is also knowledge for you as the architect. When you go to deploy and architect these things, you should know that the VPN configuration, AWS will automatically create port redundancy there. It'll give you 2 routes. Whereas when you get a direct connection, you're only going to get a single port. However, best practice will dictate that you do get 2 ports, but we'll talk about that in a second as well. So from a hardware-based VPN perspective, the components will look something like this. So at the customer side, you have the customer gateway. This is what you're going to need to configure at the customer side on your premises in order to connect to your AWS VPC. So on the AWS VPC side, you would configure something called the virtual private gateway in order to allow this connectivity to occur. Now, obviously, this connectivity is going over the internet, and this is where your VPN connection comes into play. Now, if you wanted a connection outside of the internet, it would be a private connection, and this is known as AWS's Direct Connect, where you simply have AWS show up, or your VPC will show up as a node on your WAN, or that's a direct connection, or you're going through a co-location, and I'm going to expand on those in a second as well. Now, there's one more component that I want to layer on top of this graphic here, which is the Internet Gateway. Now, the Internet Gateway is useful because as you're creating instances in your VPC on your AWS infrastructure, whether they're Linux or Windows instances, you need to give them access to the internet. This is where the Internet Gateway comes into play. You bring up and configure an Internet Gateway and allow these instances to have access to the internet.